Hi, my name's Simon Kozlina. I'm from the School of Law. I feel a little bit awkward being in front of people who are actually really good at doing their views things. My role here was more to do a show and tell on the things that I've kind of stumbled upon that kind of work and many things that don't really work at all. So you'll just see things that I've done in the past on views, and that's my main role. What I'll be talking about are two subjects, 20,011 contracts and 20,074 moot court. They're two very different subjects. Contracts is one of our core subjects in the early years, has about 650 students across two campuses, teaching staff of about 8 or 9 people. And moot court has 20 people. It's just me. We sit in a circle and then we argue at each other in a pretend courtroom, and it's a very different experience. One's core, one's the elective. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. Good, bad examples on my use of discussion boards, Turnitin, announcements, podcasts, chat rooms and lectures online. You can kind of see that I'm a views hussy. I'll try anything at least once. But I haven't gone so far as to do the Facebook integration yet, but that's kind of tempting after the first presentation. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is similar to Tim's much more detailed explanations, but this is more my attempts at those things. One thing I'd like to note when talking about a blended learning workshop is what my blended learning philosophy is. I have to say that my blended learning philosophy is that it's supplementary to learning. The discussion we're having as a university is much more that blended learning is a form of substitutive learning. That is, how do we deliver materials instead of face-to-face? So what I would suggest is think about what we've all been talking about today and consider which of these philosophies we're talking about. Most of the strategies I'm discussing are supplementary in the sense that they work to extend what occurs in face-to-face experiences. What's more difficult to consider is how do I replace face-to-face time with these other things that are being discussed. The image in the middle there is the idea that blended learning always reminds me of a blender. You put things in, it turns into this purple mash. If it's got lots of vitamins, it works wonderfully as a supplement. My wonder is if you'd prefer to have it than your meals day to day, but that just might be my view. I'm going to go now to views itself, and so if everyone could tap their little red shoes to make sure that it works correctly, because if it doesn't work, and this is, I think, one of the risks with blended learning, we're then left with the guy in the bottom right-hand corner, and his pitchfork is only really used for particular things, normally involving stables. So, first of these, views. Moot court uses discussion boards in a range of ways. The discussion boards for moot court have two parts. I thought I got past that etiquette video. Two parts, questions about mooting and obiter dictum, other comments. To talk about how I use the discussion board, we have 3 hours in class every week. It's very intense. People have to present arguments, they critique arguments, they have to sound like judges, they have to sound like lawyers, things like that. And so the discussion board is used before the class to organise who will be presenting what things. So week by week, each student will post in response to a particular post that I will put, saying that I will present on this topic, this topic, this topic, this topic. So I use the discussion boards before class in order to structure how the conversation will occur week to week. Students are volunteering for each of these things. None of these are directly accessible other than via a overall class participation mark. Very mean, but I quite like it that way. Questions about mooting is a separate topic for a range of things. The example I want to give here, fingers crossed that it loads. Clearly people aren't tapping their little red shoes. Enough at this point. For those who are listening to this, there's nothing really happening. The example that I wanted to give is this one here about a book review. And so one of the activities students have to do during class is write a review on a book that I give, a very exciting topic, mooting practices around the world. There's lots of them. And kind of like their summer holidays, when you come back to school and you have to give a review, they have to give a review on it. They post the review. These things tend to have a whole range of PowerPoint slides or YouTube videos, or it's been bizarre how much effort students have put into these things that only ever appear in an online existence. They never come to class itself. And then students comment on that itself. Plus I engage the rating system that you can have for the discussion board posts as well, so students then post these things. For some reason, when I post things, the rating's like 1, 1.5 stars, but other students get ratings of 5 and 5.5 and etc. So what I'm trying to do there is an important part of how I'm going to inform the discussion in class is occurring online. It only occurs online, and by trying to get students to participate through both responses to those discussion boards and the ratings of those posts, I'm trying to facilitate what's going to occur during each of our classes. Thanks. What I'm then going to look at is contracts. We use the discussion boards in contracts in a slightly different way. And the discussion board there is very similar to what Tim was suggesting. So there's a range of activities we're trying to do. One thing relates to assignment questions. So we have 2 assessment tasks, a research outline and then a research essay. And so what you'll find is that students can post in response to the research outline. And I find, similar to what Tim was saying, that the role of the discussion board is really good for just-in-time responses. So in the 3 days leading up to the due date, there's a spike in what's being used. What I find particularly good is that my assignments are always submitted online at midnight. And I sign off at about 6 or 6:30 and say, good luck, I'll see you tomorrow, see how it goes. The period of time between 7 p.m. and midnight, questions are still being posed, but the answers are being provided by other students. And from my perspective, it's a wonderful example of students working in a collaborative manner. There isn't questions of plagiarism going on. Students aren't doing last-minute sharing of work. They're answering really practical questions. Where would I find this reference? What's the appropriate way of sourcing this particular thing? How many words do you need to do in this part? Is there a formatting requirement? So all of these really boring questions that I find to answer are being answered by students at exactly the time that students need them. And they're being asked by one student, another student is responding, and then a third student who might have the same question is having it already answered by being online. So the discussion boards based around particular assessment tasks I find are a really useful way of both answering questions in a consistent manner across all the campuses and lecturers, and at the same time giving feedback to students at a moment in which they're actually interested in the answer that you're giving. Another of the discussion boards you'll see there is online topics discussion boards. One of the things I did with contracts in an attempt to think about how blended learning might work was to take 3 topics through the semester and then have them delivered via podcasts, plus online exercises, and then feedback to those online exercises. So you'll see there that each of the online topics was given then a series of questions. Students would then post responses to those questions, and then I would post responses to those to provide feedback. And through that method, I was trying to facilitate ways of flexible learning, or at least supplement or add to the limited time we had during semester. So the discussion boards there were really being used as a way of making online learning, online delivery of a unit effective in some form or another. The last one I was going to mention for what our discussion boards are is the topic called questions about contracts. The role of that was largely as a current awareness thing. So it was a whole series of points, also about rugby league, I have to say. Contracts and whether or not rugby league players can walk away from their contracts, very useful topic for contracts discussions. And so that discussion board was the most popular of all the discussion boards, 340 odd posts across the semester. And that really is just me and my other lecturers posting things that we find interesting, through the early weeks in semester, getting students in our classes to then respond to those questions. But the effect of that is to model the behaviour that you then would respond naturally, because of course everyone responds to the posts the lecturers make. And by the end of the semester, you've actually got conversations going on where a lecturer will post something and students from a range of classes will have that discussion about some particular point. So from my perspective, what I found really interesting about that is it's all the things you wish you could talk about in class but never do because you run out of time, and it's the things that students will then remember once they've left. So that was a way of trying to achieve that. So other things that I do for my poor suffering students. Turnitin, as with other people, I only allow submissions of assignments electronically, only via Turnitin. The way I do that is following what's always been suggested by Tracy Donnelly, was a practice submission link, really, really helpful. I don't quite understand why, but across the cohort of vUWS students, there are always some that find just clicking file, upload, correct name, difficult. So the practice link is actually really, really helpful for minimising errors. Thanks. Then I have a submission link and a late submission link. So the submission link closes at past midnight, and then they can only have later submissions after that point. I find that particularly helpful for collating late submission marks. There's a very clear way when you download the grade book results to be able to say these are late and this is the penalty to apply. So that separation between the two was an excellent tip by Tracy a long time ago. The next thing I'd mention is announcements. I use announcements with the email function where all students get the announcement as soon as it's posted as a really good way of providing information on a range of topics, especially if there are last minute changes, such as the due date of their assessment task, which happened this year because of certain IT difficulties. And having links in that to where the discussion board might be. So discussions, my grades, lectures online, etc. is quite a good way of driving students to that. The next thing I do is in terms of materials. So I ensure that all of my lecturers have the ability to be able to post materials online. Those posts can be a range of things. Some people just use their PowerPoint slides. I have a rule that everyone's PowerPoint slides must be available to all students, and so vUWS is a way of facilitating that. Others run a series of examples talking about treaties, etc. For my own one, I have a strange predilection for unusual facts in cases. So in one of the famous law cases called Butler Machine Tool Company, a battle of forms, two companies arguing what are the terms going to be, it turns on this particular thing here, which really isn't that useful other than the fact that students will remember this picture and would otherwise never have looked at it unless they were exploring on vUWS. So back to, so anyway, that's a way of having multiple lecturers provide materials at the same time. Other things I've tried at times are podcasts. So these are delivered this way. I find it's more useful for students to be able to download and repeat rather than play through the website. I've also tried the chat room to do online conversations for students for consultation times. Failed miserably. Never once had an actual student ask an actual question during a chat board replacement for a consultation time. Just doesn't work that way. The discussion boards, maybe because it's asynchronous, works much more effectively than requiring lots of people to be in the same place at the same time. The last one I just mentioned is lectures online. So I run one lecture every semester, which is revision class. Run the lecture through that. I find that particularly helpful. The number of re-watches of that in the 24 hours before the final exam is a bit scary, but at the same time is quite useful. For those that are looking at this sometime later, oops, oh no. For those looking at this sometime later, I've got a series of suggestions at the end of my presentation on what I think is good or bad about good or bad. Wait, one more. There we go. Good or bad about online learning. Consistency is excellent. Access to materials is excellent. Collaboration between students is very good. Transparency of marks is critical. So I post exam marks as soon as their final marks are released to facilitate review of grade and to actually reduce the number of review of grade applications. I think that's particularly good. The bad reliability, vulnerability. In a blended learning environment, you're incredibly vulnerable to the technology working, especially for submission of assignments. That's difficult to deal with. And the other problem is frequent users versus lurkers. You have some people who use discussion boards a lot and tend to crowd out others, and the lurkers who are there because you can see them accessing it from time to time but don't engage at all. For me, that's the real challenge about substitutive learning. How do you engage the lurkers who are willing to log on but aren't willing to actually engage with materials? If we can solve that problem, I'd be much more confident about how blended learning would work. And the last thing, sorry for breaking into questions, is the ugly part about it is it's incredibly time intensive. I love Tim's idea about an online tutor. I've never seen that before. My head of school is going to get an email about that next week. But for me, it doubles or triples coordination responsibilities. There is no basic time required for unit coordination of even medium-sized subjects. It takes up a huge amount of time. And from my perspective, I don't quite work in the same as Chris Combs. I find it very difficult to compartmentalise the work required to maintain an online website. It requires constant discussion, constant checking, etc. And so for me, that's one of the challenges. The last thing I'd suggest is, for those that look at this PowerPoint slide in the future, 3 links: Google Scholar Search on online learning substitute classroom, a range of really interesting stories about what works and what doesn't work if you're trying to substitute face-to-face time. The second one, the Google image search on blended learning. Fascinating to see how people around the world try to convey the concept of blended learning. Have a look at some time. You'll see a lot of different models are implicit in the pictures they use. And the third one, a recent conversation by Shirley Alexander on the Conversation website, The Limits of Online Education. Really good discussion about what we can possibly achieve through online learning, but also what are the real problems given the cohort of students that certain universities might have. Thanks very much.